Hello, I'm Alexander von Welczeck, and we're here again today with my mama, Annette von Welczeck, telling Annette's story. Today's chapter 4. We're going to diverge a little bit, and Annette is going to tell us all about her Rocky, Rochus von Welczeck, who she married on July 1st, 1961 in Germany. Annette, tell us about Rocky's family, about his family history, because it's such a fascinating story. Tell us about the man that you love.
Well, I met him in San Francisco at the Fairmont, and then, our love blossomed somehow into marriage. We got married the 1st of July in Germany, because he followed there. And then Rochus, his name, we called him Rocky in America, but in Europe his name was Rochus. That's a famous saint in Europe, Holy Rochus. And Rochus came from an old family in Silesia, which used to be a Prussian area. And the family was the von Welczecks were an old Prussian family, goes like 1,000 years back. It was Bohemian and Austrian, then it was Prussian. Anyway, his father was an officer in the Kaiser army, and which these were at that time were running Berlin really. But then after the First World War, all these officers lost their standing. Is that the right word? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they didn't even have a pension, nothing, just because it was all over that time. Then, because the Weimar Republic started, and of course the old Baron, he was Baron Günther von Welczeck, he married a pretty rich girl in Ziegenhals, it was called, the town. And the old Baron was already 40 years old when he got married, and so was and Martha was like 30, and she was a tennis champion in Silesia. She was a very good tennis player. Anyway, they got married in 1920, right, 2 years after the war. And then at some point they had 2 boys right away, and then at some point with all the recession going on, they moved to Heidelberg, and in Heidelberg Martha opened a school, because she was a school teacher too, and she opened a school for American boys that wanted to learn, not just boys, students, wanted to learn German, because they were going to the medical school in Heidelberg. Was very famous. A lot of American young people went there to study medicine and probably biology and other things. Anyway, then in 1929, Rochus came 10 years later. The other 2 boys were already in a boarding school for young officers I forgot the name. In Liegnitz, that's right, Liegnitz. There's a famous school there. And then Rochus was born 10 years later. And I always have a feeling the mother called him Rochus because he probably had a Rochus. In Germany you say, when you're mad at something, you say, ich hab so ein Rochus. He said, no, my mother wasn't like that, but I'm very sure that was something like that. Anyhow, then in 1929, Rochus was born, and that was the year when the stock market collapsed. Wall Street totally collapsed. And suddenly no more students from America came. And there was poor Martha sitting with a little baby, and no more students that lived in her place that she could tutor. She had a few teachers and everything. They had a nice big villa there. So they moved back again to Silesia. And they lived first with the mother. They had a very large house because they had a big factory. And then the old Baron inherited from his oldest sister, who was much, much older, Baroness von Bern. I still have some silverware from it. It's a big V and the big crown on it. And so they inherited the Villa zu guter Letzt. That means the villa of the last, right? In Paczkau, which is a beautiful historic town in Silesia. It's a little bit like Rothenburg. They called it the Rothenburg of the East, if anybody knows what Rothenburg is. It's a fabulous little town.
Rothenburg is the very famous, well-preserved medieval city in Germany, not so far from
the Neckar.
Nuremberg, kind of near Nuremberg area.
Yeah. And this was what Pachkau was in the east. I've been there a couple of times. It had a big wall around it. You were there with me once, remember? Very interesting little town. Anyway, they moved into the Villa zu guter Letzt with all the beautiful insides, because the older sister was like 15 years older or something. She didn't have any children, so Günther inherited everything. Okay? So they lived there, and then the war started. And then, of course, the two boys had to go to war from the officer school. And as soon as the war against Russia started, they both were on the Russian front. And Rocky was growing up with his mother there, and he said, and he was not very good at doing his homework, and he did always all kinds of nonsense, and that his mother had to chase him around sometimes, he said it was. And but she also was very sad, because the son Dieter was apparently a really nice young boy. He was killed, and so that brought a lot of depression to the house. And then the end of the war came, and Rocky had to go to war. He was only 15 years old. They took them all out of high school. The whole class had to go to war. And he was stationed in Czechoslovakia with his whole class. And then one day, it was the last days of the war, the Russians were very much advancing, and it was the last days, and his officer told him, Rochus, you have to go home. Something happened at home. And then he came home, and the villa was bombed, totally bombed, flattened by some Russian planes, and everybody was dead. The parents were dead, the old 95-year-old grandmother was dead, the maids, everybody was dead. And he came there, he still had to bury them, when I think about it. All this happened on the 20th of March, 1945, and that also happened to be Rochus' birthday. That's when he became 16 years old. And he had to face all this. I mean, when I think about it, it's unbelievable. And he buried everybody, and I have a funny anecdote. And he put flowers on the graves and all that. And then it was getting warmer, and he had to bring water to water the flowers. And then the Russian soldiers that were sort of staying guard, the Russians had moved in the meantime, but he put his little short leather pants on, because then they thought he was a child. If they had known he had been a soldier, they would have arrested him. So he was so skinny, so they thought he was a child, which he was really. But then the water he brought to the cemetery, the Russians would take the bucket away from him and drink it. And he said, well, I'm going to get even with you one day. And he peed into the water before he arrived. That was Rocky. And he said, I had to laugh inside when they were drinking, and he said it gave him such satisfaction. So he lived there, and should I tell that story when he had the opportunity to shoot the general? Oh, that's a little bit too much.
Yeah, why not?
Well, he was also being so young, he knew the high school in and out, and it was wild. So he would go in the attic there of the high school, and there was a window, and there were guns there. And then one day he saw that the Russian general was taking eine Parade. Wie heißt das in English?
Parade?
The parade,
marching through town?
Marching. No, when they go and in front of all the soldiers, and the general, nehmen eine Parade ab. I don't know that expression in English, eine Parade abnehmen. Anyway, that's what he did. And Rocky said, I had him in Kimmel. I was so mad. I wanted to kill him, he said, because he was, parents dead, everybody dead. I wanted to kill him. And then the last minute he thought, I'm not going to do it. If I do this, then they will kill the whole village or the whole town up, So he didn't do it. And they never found him anyway. He always and then one day the governor there, the Russian governor, asked him to come to the office, to headquarters, and then he said, okay, you're a young boy, Welczeck is very, it's Polish name, you go to we bring you to Russia and you become a Russian officer. They thought they still could brainwash him, but he always had heard he never wanted to be a communist, right? So that night he took, when he heard that he should, then he said like this to the officer, okay, what time should I be here tomorrow? And they told him, be here at 10 o'clock. And that night he took a bike and he went to the west. And it took him like over a week to get to the west because he had to go over Berlin. All the streets were ruined, so that was very difficult. And he ended up in Heidelberg then. Like a couple of weeks later, he was in Heidelberg by himself. Brothers, family, everybody was gone. So he arrived in Heidelberg and he remembered a name of some old professor from his mother's time there, and he went there and the old professor said, well, boy, I can't help you much, I have nothing to eat myself, nobody had any food, and shelter was very rare. So, and you only could go to Heidelberg if you were born there. That was his luck too, because all the cities were bombed out, but Heidelberg not so much. So this old professor had connections to the Schloss Hotel where the American officers had their headquarters. And he did a lot of translating for them. And he said, I tried to get you a job with the American officers. And that's what he did. He talked to them and he told them that he was, an orphan. And so Rochus had to start as a bellboy at the Schloss Hotel. He didn't know what a bellboy was. He said, a bellboy. He thought he had to ring a bell all the time. And so he went there and he had the best time of his life there. All these American officers, there were a lot of old general staff there, including Eisenhower's headquarters in Europe, in Germany, not in Europe. In Europe was actually Paris, but in Germany it was Heidelberg, the headquarters. So he met Eisenhower and General Taylor and Mills or something, very famous general, and what was the other one again? Who made
Patton?
Yeah. Patton was in the very beginning killed, right? Mm-hmm. We don't know if it was killed or an accident. Nobody still knows. So then Mrs. Patton always came, and Mrs. Patton actually fell in love with Rochus, but she wanted to go and see certain places in Germany like Rothenburg and Schwetzing and all the historic places. And that's when she always took Rochus and he had to show her all these places and had to be the translator too, And he said Mrs. Patton was such a lovely lady. She was very good. She made beautiful music too. She was quite a musician apparently. She came always after her husband was dead. She always came because he was buried in Belgium, and so from Heidelberg she always had a connection to go to Belgium to visit the grave of General Patton. And this very famous who did the
Marshall?
The Marshall Plan, yeah, General Marshall. Mm-hmm. And then also Eisenhower told he had to serve him. He drank only. What did I always tell you? Not Jimmy Beam, the other one. The famous
Jack Daniels?
Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels was the drink of Eisenhower. And every night he had his cocktails, and once in a while he would say, Junior, I can drink so much tonight, I have to call Washington in a few hours, because it was this 6 hours difference from Washington. So then, of course, after the second drink, Eisenhower would say, I want another one. And Rocky would tell him, General, you can't have another one. And he said, oh, one more. And Rocky said, no, I'm not going to bring you another one. And he didn't. He did not bring him another one. And Eisenhower was always grateful afterwards. He always said, that was very good, Junior. Yeah. So he had a very good relationship with all these people. And of course, money was worthless. But what the officers gave him a lot for certain services, a whole batch of cigarettes. And with that, he would go to the black market and would get himself clothes and stuff like that, you know. So he was, bartering was a big thing. Money was nothing really, right? And then a couple of years went by and the ladies arrived, you know, the women of the generals.
Of the officers, yeah.
Yeah, of the officers. And they fell all in love with young Junior. He looked, when he was a young boy, something like a young, whatever I would tell you, what's his name again? I always told you. The actor.
Robert Redford?
Yeah, he was like a young Robert Redford, that's true. He was very handsome. And so these ladies all said, Junior, you have to come to America. That was a big thing. And they called up all the time the consulate to get the papers for him. So he applied for it, but it was very difficult you had to be either Jewish or a war bride to come to America. But he was none of these, so he had a tough time. But finally he was summoned to Karlsruhe, no, Mannheim, and to get his papers. And when he arrived there, they said, God, I'll be glad to get rid of you. Every day we get a phone call from some woman, you know, all these women always called. Junior has to get the papers to come to America. And of course he had a sponsor, and the sponsor was a General Bush. General Bush was a quartermaster general of General Patton in the Third Army during the war, right? And Mrs. Bush also, she never had a son, so she almost looked at Rochus as her son. And they brought him to America, and they were about that same time also coming back to Washington. I think they retired. And then Rocky was on the boat coming to America. He said he was the only one that was not a war bride or something like that. And he had exactly $100 in his pocket when he came to America. Well, he came to Washington, D.C. and applied right away, went for a job, and he found a job at the Mayflower Hotel. And he actually got 2 jobs there. In the evening, he worked in the nightclub there. They had a famous nightclub. And then during the day, he would work lunch in the main dining room. And he started to make really money. That was very exciting to him. He never had made money before, because there was really no money in Germany. So then he saw a lot of the famous, those generals and politicians he had met in Heidelberg. Many times they always recognized him. Junior, you are now in America. That was a great thing for him. He knew so many people, and even Eisenhower came once in a while. And then when Eisenhower became 1952, I believe Rocky was at that time about 3 years in America, and he became president, and he sent a messenger if he wouldn't want to work for him, and Rocky sent back a message, no, thank you, General, but I'm making real money now, and that's what he wanted. He wanted to be free. He didn't want to work at the White House, because you're like a prisoner there, right? You have to live within the walls. That was not his cup of tea. Anyway, he stayed there in Washington, D.C., and then suddenly he got the message he had to be drafted to go to war in Korea. And that he did not want to do, because he had just fought, was in a war. He says, I will never go to war for no country. And he met some influential guy who gave him some good advice. He said, what could I do? I don't want to go to war. I can't do that. And then this man told him, go to another city and go to college. And that's when he decided to go to San Francisco and go to college there. And that's what he did. He came, I believe, I don't know the exact year, but it was in probably 53 or something, or more before that.
Probably 53, if Eisenhower became...
52,
yeah.
53.
Yeah.
He went to San Francisco and went immediately there to college for studying hospitality, and he found a job at the Fairmont Hotel. The Fairmont Hotel, he worked in the Venetian room, which was also a nightclub. That's where always the big bucks are. And then when he graduated from college, they gave him the job as maitre d' of the main dining rooms, the Camellia room, the Carousel, and there was another one. Anyway, he became a maitre d', and I guess he really enjoyed it. And the Camellia Room was famous for the old ladies from Nob Hill went there a lot, and he was the darling of the old ladies from Nob Hill. And then, well, all I know is he worked there, and then I came to the Fairmont in 1960, and when he saw me, he had different girlfriends all the time, but nothing to get married to apparently. And then one day when I was working at the front desk, he told me later, when he saw me there behind the desk, he told himself, that's the girl I'm going to marry. And I said to myself, if I had known that, I would have given him a very hard time, right? Which I did anyway. So then, well, he worked as maitre d', and when I started to work there in 60, that's when we two met. And I don't think there's anything else. Well, pretty much.
So you were dating, and then you decided to go to Germany to get married in the church with your mother and family.
Oh, yeah.
Did that all go smoothly, or were there any?
No, there were a couple hitches because, first of all, mother was not so excited about it that I was going to get married to somebody who wanted to live in America. He even had a few offers to come back to Germany, and he says, no, he wants to live. He loved to be an American. He didn't want to come back, even though he had some pretty good job offers, because Germany was just coming back then. And then it was all taken care of that we would get married. And then suddenly the priest, because we were Catholic, my mother was super Catholic, and of course Rocky came from a Catholic family. Oberschlesien is very Catholic, and then suddenly the priest said he couldn't marry us, and my mother had turned all the candles all over the house. The candles were burning. Why not? Because the priest says, "What do I know? He comes from America. He could have been that he was married before." And that just didn't work with the Catholic Church. Then at that time they were still very strict about all these things. So this upset him so much. So my brother drove him to Münster, where the bishop is. The bishop lives in a big palais. And the biggest palais in Münster is the Bishop Palais. And so he went into the palace, and the sister said to him, there was a, what is it called, eine Schwester.
A nun?
A nun.
Yeah.
A nun was there. And she said, the bishop isn't there here. And he looked at her, he said, you're not supposed to lie. And he opened the door behind her, and there was the bishop sitting. He just walked right in, and he gave the bishop, he told him what he was on his mind. Excuse me. And he told him also that in his family in the past, there were even bishops in the von Welczeck family. There were several bishops. You can even still see the graves in Breslau, which is now Wrocław, right?
Wrocław now, yeah.
It's now Polish. That whole area is Polish now, where my husband came from. And that's why he escaped. He wanted did not want to become a communist or Polish. And then he told the bishop his story, and was very upset about it. He says, I come so many thousands of miles to marry the love of my life, and you create all these problems and so on. Oh, the bishop was shaking in his boots, he says, and called up the priest and gave the priest a hard time, and everything was okay then. So the next thing is we got married in a beautiful castle by Herzog vom Stein there. It's in Westphalia, near Lünen, right? Mm-hmm. Near Lünen. And it was all taken care of. The 1st of July, then we got married. And it was a wonderful wedding. We didn't invite an awful lot of people, just the relatives and a few really good friends. We might have been 30, 40 people. And it was the hottest day. My mother had arranged a beautiful dinner and champagne. Nobody even wanted to drink the champagne. It was so hot.
I think this is a good time to take a little break.
Yeah.
Where you are married now to Rochus.
Yeah.
And when we restart the next chapter, we'll talk about your family life and where you lived in America and your family and children and so forth.
Well, I should really talk about when we were married. A couple of days later, we took Pan Am and flew to Paris. And I introduced my husband to Paris, and that became his favorite city in the world. And we had a wonderful time in Paris. I could finally, also being pregnant, I was always hiding it. My mother never found out. So finally I could buy a little hanging dress and let loose. And I showed him Paris and he just loved it. We stayed at the Grand Hotel, I think more than a week. It's right next to the opera in Paris. And we had a beautiful large room. And I remember they had these big bathtubs there and we could take a bath with two, you know. It was really a honeymoon there. It was wonderful. And we had dinner in the Eiffel Tower on top and all the little restaurants in the streets there. And he just loved Paris. And then from Paris, of course, then we flew home to San Francisco. And then he went back to work and he said to me, you are looking for a house now, and I go back to work. And that was my job now. And that's now we can start.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you very much.